Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second day and second and final day of sessions at this Character Project workshop. If there are some of you joining us today that weren't with us yesterday, welcome. This morning, our first speaker is Taya Cohen from Carnegie Mellon University, and I will turn it over to her.
Thank you. Nice warm welcome. All right, mic's working okay? Yeah? All right, so today I'm going to tell you about a project called Character Traits in the Workplace. So I think I might be the lone business school representative here. I'm a psychologist, and this works in collaboration with quantitative psychologist Abigail Panter from the University of North Carolina. We have labeled this project the WECT Project as our working title for Work Experiences and Character Traits. And basically what it is a 3-month weekly online diary study of employed adults across the United States. And our goal here is to investigate how character, personality, emotions, and different treatment by managers, coworkers affect the frequency with people, in which people engage in ethical and unethical behavior at their jobs. So there's a large literature in the organizational behavior field on helping behaviors at work, things like organizational citizenship. So helping coworkers with their personal responsibilities, their work responsibilities. I'll show you some items from these scales. As well as what actually I'm very interested in is counterproductive work behaviors. So these are all the bad behaviors at work. Small things like showing up late for a meeting, stealing office supplies, big things like physically abusing coworkers. And what's interesting is there is this large literature on these behaviors, but it's not really speaking to the morality literature. One of the goals in this project is to bridge these and start to talk about character traits, things that moral psychologists, behavioral business ethics people are talking about, and integrate it with this literature on workplace deviance and citizenship. So to kind of place this work, it's at the intersection of social personality psychology, which is where my background is, as well as organizational behavior, which is where I am now. And trying to kind of speak to both the management science people who are doing work on behavioral ethics, as well as psychologists, and today philosophers and theologists as well. So this project and this talk today is going to be a little different than what I usually do because it was a more comprehensive data collection. We have a lot of measures, so I'm going to take advantage of the workshop aspect of today and present a lot of details on the methods, what we did, hopefully solicit some ideas from you about some of the interesting questions that we'll be able to test. And if you have, we put up a website because there were so many measures, so if you have any questions about the details, it's all up there, wectproject.org. And because I'm presenting a lot of details on the methods, I have a lot of information on the slides, just if you want references, and I'll try and talk you through what's important. So this project, if you were a respondent in it, there was 14 surveys that you completed throughout the course of 3 months, and then we had a coworker take a survey about you. So there was an initial battery, this survey that was about an hour to 75 minutes long, where we tried to be as comprehensive as we could, and any measure we could think of that we reasonably had time for about character traits we tried to include, as well as other information, demographic information, and a lot of different measures about the person's workplace to get an idea of what situations they're experiencing at work. And then every week for 12 weeks on Friday, the survey research firm that we hired for the work would send out an email with a link to a survey. It took about 20 to 30 minutes. We assessed their emotions they experienced at work, their work behaviors that I'll tell you about, different how they're treated, like abusive supervision, workplace ostracism, different aspects of the work environment. And then final survey, week 13, which is the same as the initial survey, just slightly shorter. About a month into the project, we had participants give us an email address of a coworker who might be willing to take a survey about them, and we emailed the coworkers, and we collected their judgments of the person's personality, some of the character traits, as well as the work behaviors, which is, so both these methods are used, observer reports are used to ask about people's citizenship behaviors, their counterproductive work behaviors. You can imagine that people might be biased if they're telling you what about their bad behavior. On the other hand, they know more about their bad behavior than their coworkers, so we wanted to and be able to get both kinds of assessments. So some of the key research questions that we're beginning to answer now and we'll continue to answer over the next year. The first is the big one, which I think, big question, not really an easy answer, but we have data that speak to it, which is what personality situational factors predict ethical and unethical work behaviors. One of the advantages of this project is because we were quite comprehensive, or at least larger scale than many other existing projects, we're hoping to be able to test the incremental validity. So how much does moral reasoning, how much variance does moral reasoning account for relative to, say, emotions or the big five dimensions or other aspects, and really try and compare what character traits seem to be really important, what other things might help a little bit but not as important, and also what are the relationships among a number of different personality dimensions. And how do they compare to work situations every week? Are character traits stable over time? So we have this initial survey and a final survey 13 weeks later, 3 months. So to what extent do character traits, traits that are relevant to moral behaviors, immoral behaviors, what is their stability relative to other dimensions of personality? Is character more or less stable? I'll present some data relevant to that at the end of the talk today. Are character traits observable? Can we see character? I think this is an interesting question, and we have the observer reports. I'll present some findings relevant to this one about the self and observer agreement among coworkers, and in this case it's coworkers who know the person quite well because they're completing an hour-long survey. You know, if they didn't know them that well, they probably wouldn't have agreed to that. But we have some initial evidence that people can see character, and I'll present that today. And a big question which we haven't started to tackle yet, but it's very important in the psychology literature. There's a lot of debate about emotions versus moral reasoning or cognitive moral development. We asked about their emotions that they're experiencing every week. So one of the questions we hope to look at is how does people's moral reasoning, using a standard measure of that, compare to their emotions in predicting these behaviors at work. Both emotions and moral reasoning have, there's evidence that they both are related to ethical and unethical work behaviors. So it'll be interesting in the same context of the same study to investigate them. So many possible questions, and hopefully you'll have some ideas for us. So the participants in this study, we hired a Qualtrics survey research firm, and they subcontracted Survey Sampling International to do large-scale data collections, which we're calling the WECT 2011, WECT 2012. They're identical. Both had the same design. One was September through December. That was going to be our only one, the big one, except for there was a major problem that the survey research firm made that meant we had to do it again. So what happened was, unbeknownst to us, if a person missed a survey in the first version of the project, WECT 2011, the survey firm did not send them an email the next week. So if you missed week 3, you didn't get week 4 or week 5. So we found out about this in week 10 after some emails from participants who were curious why they weren't getting surveys anymore. And this is a problem because that means the people in the survey are sort of a biased sample, right? They're overly conscientious, so the people who have made a promise to complete it and they're completing it. Obviously, this is relevant to ethics. So we were really frustrated. Took some negotiations with them. We said, well, okay, for the remaining surveys, 10 through the final survey, send it to everyone. So which they did, but then we decided our weekly data was questionable, maybe usable, we'll see, but we ran the entire thing again, which on the upside, we have a lot more data now than we thought we would get, especially for the initial survey and the final survey and the coworkers. And it will be, so my colleague's a quantitative psychologist, and she's excited to look at like missing data patterns and comparing the two samples, so there could be some methodological interesting questions. In any case, we do have, I'll show you the sample sizes in a moment. So the people who are in this study, it's a diverse group of people all across the United States, so people from all 50 states. The requirements that you had to be 18 or older to give consent, had to be employed full-time, so working 35 or more hours per week, and then consent to complete this initial battery and weekly surveys, and also consent to inviting a coworker to take a survey about you. The survey research firm paid them based on the surveys they completed. Not a lot of money, but a little bit of money. What was interesting and rewarding from this study that surprised me, in the open-ended comments we would get at the end of the survey, when we say, do you have any comments for the research team, a lot of people were really interested in the project and excited to tell us about their workplace. You can imagine, especially if it's not going well, that you now have an outlet with these professors who are asking you, and you can tell what a jerk your boss is, or your coworkers. And people, we were surprised, getting used to running just short 15-minute surveys. People were looking forward every week to telling us, or at least some of them. Other people did say it was boring, but to do the same survey 12 weeks in a row. But in any case, overall, there was positive responses. So they were employed in a wide range of industries. So one of the nice things about doing a big online sample is you have people from all over the country. So this isn't representative in the random sampling sense, but we have 1,500 people who, their incomes range from basically a caregiver for the elderly who said $0 for the income to a doctor who said $750,000. I mean, so these are self-reported income, but we tried to really screen and look at people's responses carefully to make sure what they were writing about their job made sense with the income and other things. And then all different sectors were represented. We had private, for-profit companies, government workers, and we have lots of information about their jobs and industries. So in terms of our sample size, so our goal when we were writing the proposal was to have 250 people. We have 1,500, so that was good in the initial survey. So our first one, the survey firm and us, we'd never done a project of this scale to see what our response rates would be. So we didn't know how to exactly what we would get. But with, say, just 2012, this was the good version of the study. We started with 500 people about. By the end, we had 300. And then every week, we have at least 250 people responding. And then the co-works, we had 126 of those. With the initial survey, part of the Mystic communication, they started with 1,000, but then we have 500 at the end, 215 coworkers. These data, like I said, the sample's a little biased, so it's questionable to what extent those are generalizable, but we'll be able to compare. For the paper we're working on now, focusing on this initial 1,500 people, this retest to do the stability of character, we have the 845, and then 341 coworkers. So a nice, big, diverse group of employed adults. All right, so what did we ask? The initial survey was long, and it was about 5 sections. It allowed them to take breaks. Basically, there was a week in which they could complete it. If you closed the browser window, you could come back to it at any time. And we built in screens saying, now section 1's over, you can take a break. I think sitting for 75 minutes to do a survey would be quite long, so most people did take breaks. The first section was a demographic questionnaire, some information about jobs. The second section, we started to include some individual difference measures, some of the measures we really cared about related to character, personality. Then we had a big job section of different work questionnaires. Section 4 is a lot of individual differences related to character, some of which we've heard about today, things like, like moral identity and other aspects like that. And then the last section, we had a test of moral reasoning, cognitive moral development. So I'm not going to go over all the measures, but if you have questions, or sort of at the end, I can come back to them. But we have a lot of different information about their jobs. There's been some recent work in organizational behavior on sleep, which is an interesting one, where people who sleep less, get less sleep, are more unethical at their jobs. So I read that paper and said, we got to put a question about sleep every week. So that would be an interesting one. But different things, job satisfaction, intent, whether they're looking for another job, and then descriptive information, how many people they supervise, things like that. I'll say the 2 surveys, the 2 questionnaires that I'm most interested in are these 2. The guilt and shame proneness scale. We developed it, so that's why we're kind of interested in it. I'll tell you a little bit about that and some of our findings, but guilt proneness is, we're finding an important character trait in that it predicts people's unethical behaviors, lying in negotiation, counterproductive work behaviors, things along these lines. I'll define it a little more detail in a bit. And then the other inventory we were really interested in is this hexaco, which it's similar to the big 5, except for it adds this 6th dimension, which is important, called honesty, humility. So there's a past decade worth of work now, or a little more, by Ashton and Lee, which have shown that it outperforms the big 5 in predicting behaviors related to ethics. So workplace deviance, cheating, or lying, things along these lines. The 6th dimension of moral character seems to add things above agreeableness and conscientiousness and other relevant personality dimensions. And then also, so it stands for honesty, humility, emotionality, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, openness to experience. So the major personality dimensions are also covered. And this is one of the ways we'll be able to compare character-related personality traits to these other dimensions of personality, which may be somewhat less relevant to character in terms of predicting behavior. Okay, so we had self-control, which we actually included in the second version, so we've heard a little bit about that today. Different work-related questionnaires. This one, this work design questionnaire, these are the first time I've used a lot of these measures. This one has 77 items in it. These are all the subscales in that measure. So if basically we wanted to cover our bases and say, okay, if someone has a question about, say, social support or interdependence at work, ergonomics, physical demands, we'll at least be able to go back to that later and answer those questions. Then different things like organizational constraints, which has been shown to predict people's unethical behaviors at work. For this audience, these might be some of the measures that you would be interested in. We have empathy, empathic concern, and perspective taking. These have been shown, as we've heard yesterday, to be important dimensions of character. Moral identity. This moral philosophies is ethics position questionnaire. So we may consideration of future consequences. Some items relevant to the exploitiveness, entitlement dimension of narcissism. It's part of the dark triad, for those of you familiar with psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism, which are this kind of suite of personality characteristics that have been associated with bad behaviors. And then the last section was a test of moral reasoning. Another area I had not ventured in before this project, but it's this defining issues test is a widely used measure. It's actually you have to pay to use it, which so you can't even score it yourself. But we decided it would be important to test how does moral reasoning based on like a Kohlberg kind of model. And we heard about yesterday about the Heinz stealing bread for his dying wife dilemma. So that's in here. This is a shorter version that takes about 15, 20 minutes. Okay, with me so far? Okay. And then the last, we just had these open-ended comments, which was very useful for screening out participants who are putting random strings of letters. There's about 75 of those total in the project. So in the different open-ended questions, one of my graduate students read through every survey every week to make sure the data we were getting was good quality. And there's a few, but not many, people with bad responses, and we were able to get look at those through this open-ended questions. Okay, so that was the initial survey. The final survey was basically the same. We didn't do the moral reasoning measure again, and some of the work information was not in this last one, but basically all the individual difference measures we have at week 1 and week 13. So not longitudinal in the sense of developmental trajectories, but certainly nice data in terms of we have 3 months in between to see how stable are these self-reports of personality and character. Okay, the weekly surveys is where some of the meat of the project is. We ask about emotions and then behaviors and experiences at work during the past week. By the past week, we mean the previous 7 days. We give them different assurances about confidentiality and anonymity. So for the emotion side, we used 2 standard measures, the PANAS, or PANAS, the positive and negative affect schedule, which is a list of different adjectives, emotion words, and you rate the extent to which you felt this way during the past week. We added some others in addition to the 20 that are in that measure. We have a standard depression inventory, the Center for the CESD. Okay. I should also note, these measures, there's a lot of randomization going on, so the items are all randomized, the scale orders are randomized, different things like that, so make sure we're not getting order effects. Then the work section, we first just started with an open-ended question about whether there had been any changes at work during the past week, and if there had, to let us know about them. If they changed jobs, if they weren't employed full-time, the survey wasn't relevant, so then they were out. But there was only, I think, 2 or 3 people for that happened to. These are all our work measures. The most important that I'll talk about today is this counterproductive work behavior checklist and the organizational citizenship checklist. And these are what we're calling the ethical and unethical work behaviors. And I'll show you the items in a moment. But we also have a number of scales that assess different situations, right? We have personality, we have situations. So things like the level of interpersonal conflict at work, abusive supervision, discrimination at work, interactional justice, how fair you're treated at work. So in terms of work behaviors, this is the instructions that participants got. They had to indicate how often you did each of the following things at your job during the past week, from not at all to 4 or more times, and we had a not applicable option for them, which was coded as missing. And then they were presented with a list randomized for each participant with 32 counterproductive behaviors and 20 citizenship behaviors. And these are based on standard measures. The unethical work behaviors, the counterproductive ones, there's 5 categories. So these are behaviors that are intended to harm the organization or the people within the organization. Abuse, so starting or continuing a damaging or harmful rumor at work, being nasty or rude to a client or customer. Production deviance, so doing your work incorrectly or purposely working slowly. Sabotage, wasting your employer's materials or supplies. Theft, stealing office supplies. Putting to be paid more hours than you worked. Withdrawal, coming to work late, staying home from work, saying you were sick. I think it's pretty clear they're bad behaviors. If you're curious, I have the whole list here. We also wanted to look at good behaviors. So the citizenship ones, picked up a meal for others, lending a compassionate ear to someone if they have a problem, finish something for a coworker, defending a coworker, different. One thing that's starting to be some evidence for in the organizational literature, and I think we'll probably see it in the psychology literature soon, is there's differences in what predicts bad behaviors versus good behaviors. Bad and good are not always the same. So I think it's important to look at these separately and not just assume that the people who are doing bad behaviors are the opposite of the ones doing the good behaviors. There's some evidence now that certain traits, certain emotions lead people to do bad behaviors and then also lead them to do good behaviors as well. So these organizational citizenship and counterproductive work behavior can actually be positively correlated within the same person. Okay, so to make sure that these were actually relevant to the moral domain, we did a pilot test where we surveyed 443 people using Amazon MTurk to rate each of these behaviors on how immoral to moral they are, extremely immoral to moral. And as you might expect, looking at that list, all the counterproductive behaviors were rated below the midpoint as immoral. So some were worse than others, some were slightly immoral, some were extremely immoral. All the positive citizenship behaviors were rated as moral behaviors. So we felt confident based on these ratings that it would be appropriate to think of unethical work behaviors as counterproductive behaviors, organizational citizenship as ethical, right, the above and beyond. Okay, we had a Coworker Survey as well. They rated all those organizational citizenship, counterproductive work behaviors. They also filled out the guilt and shame proneness scale and the Hexaco inventory. So we have judgments of the coworker's personality and a couple character traits, as well as their behaviors, as well as how well they knew them, which was quite well. On a 1 to 5 scale, it was about 4.0. So people here have pretty good, accurate. I want to say accurate. They know the person pretty well, and mostly for a long time. Okay, so that's a lot on the methods that I flew through, but now let me tell you just about some interesting findings to pique your interest, and hopefully more next year. The first thing we wanted to look at was guilt proneness and also honesty, humility. And why we're interested in these is there's a number of papers now that have shown that they predict unethical work behaviors, unethical behaviors in a variety of different domains. So given that they predict bad behaviors, we think it's reasonable to consider them as character traits. And we wanted, and our first goal is to compare the observability, the coworker reports, as well as their stability over the 3-month time period, and compare them to the big 5 dimensions of emotionality, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness. So let me unpack guilt proneness a little bit because it's been an interest of mine for the past several years. It's a personality trait, an individual difference. It reflects a predisposition to experience negative feelings about personal wrongdoing, even when that wrongdoing is private. So if you imagine that I would feel bad about my behavior if I did that. So we because it's guilt, right? We think of guilt as an emotion. This is an emotional trait. So it's the anticipation of feeling guilty about committing transgressions. This is different than a person who just feels guilty all the time about everything without some kind of eliciting event. It's different than some kind of feeling guilty in a particular moment. This is an individual different, a personality trait. So what we found in some of our previous work, people who are high in this personality dimension, they lie less. So for example, I teach a negotiations class, and I've had my students complete this inventory at the beginning of the semester. About a month later, when they're negotiating in class, I've had their counterpart, how honest do you think your counterpart was in the negotiation? The people who are high in guilt proneness are rated as more honest, less unethical. They lie less in different behavioral economics kinds of paradigms. I'll show you a graph in a moment about their counterproductive work behaviors. The idea here is that the anticipation of guilty feelings, even if no one knows about what you've done, it represents your conscience in a way. So public surveillance isn't necessarily required to make sure you act ethically, that people would feel guilty if they transgressed. We measure this with the GASP scale, where you read about different situations that people might encounter, and there's a response, and you have to rate the likelihood of the response. How likely is it that I would react in the way described, from very unlikely to very likely? So there's 4 items, which makes it a nice short measure. These are there's other items in this scale that measure related constructs like shame proneness that are related but not quite as relevant to character. But things like, one of my favorites is the red wine example. Coworker's house warming party, you spill red wine, you cover the stain with a chair, nobody notices. What's the likelihood that you would feel that the way you acted was pathetic? Most people do say, like, slightly, I would feel, they would say slightly likely, but there's variation. The people who are saying slightly likely to very likely, or I think the people that say, no, not, I wouldn't feel bad at all, they're rare, but you do get some. So
That's interesting phrasing, because like feeling like it was pathetic isn't necessarily feeling guilty about it.
Yeah. So we didn't use what defines guilt here is a negative evaluation of your behavior. So we didn't want to use the words guilt and shame. These are loaded terms. People do interpret them differently. So the one common theme is that you're feeling bad about your behavior. Okay, so we didn't say feeling guilty. So all of these, and a different severity when we went through different scale development. Different batteries, these came out as sort of good predictive items, but you'd feel uncomfortable about keeping the money, you'd feel remorse about breaking the law. So there are other items in the GAS scale about feeling bad about yourself, feeling like a terrible person. Okay, so that should be shame proneness in here. But here the idea is all of what these have in common is feeling bad about your behavior. And the nice thing is it's not any particular situation. The idea here is that it's a lot of different kinds of situations, and people who across different kinds of transgressions would be more likely to say, yeah, I feel really bad about my behavior. I think the way I acted was pathetic, in things at different severity and other aspects. So here's a recent paper we had in the Journal of Business Ethics where we looked at guilt proneness and counterproductive work behavior. So just visually I trichotomized it just so you could see if we chunked people into like the high, top, say 40% here, versus the lowest 40%, or 30%, versus the middle. These are compared to the average level of counterproductive work behaviors a person might commit. So the high guilt-prone people are much less likely than average to commit these behaviors. And in fact, if you look at just their ratings, they're close to 0, very few of them. Whereas the people who are saying, no, I wouldn't feel that the way I acted was pathetic, they're committing a lot more of these bad behaviors. These are standard deviations. And what's interesting and important, if we include into the model a lot of other variables that have been shown previously to predict these counterproductive work behaviors, guilt proneness is still significant. So if we can include things like gender, because women do commit fewer of these, if we do intention to turnover, the people that are planning on leaving their jobs, or just negative affect at work, interpersonal conflict, we're still finding a significant effect of this character trait. So this was one. This is not from the diary study we did, but we're hoping to replicate this and show over time with the weekly surveys that we're also showing this pattern. These data here are from the diary study, and we haven't really unpacked these relationships yet, but one of the goals is to kind of get the landscape of character traits. You know, there's a lot of papers on one individual difference. So I have papers on guilt proneness, someone else might have papers on moral identity. Very little research trying to integrate them. And you can see these are all, I don't know if they're all, but it seems most of these are relevant to character. So things like honesty, humility, empathy, moral identity, consideration of future consequences, they seem to be related to character. I guess that Machiavellianism should be negative. But it's hard. So we're hoping through factor analysis, through other kinds of analyses, to try and see how do these different character traits relate to one another. This is a slide. There's some theologists in the room, so I put this in at the last minute because often the question of guilt and religion comes up, which I must say I haven't been able to make sense of completely. Everyone, usually if I give a talk about guilt proneness, people will say, oh, well, Catholics and Jews probably feel guiltier than the rest of the population. Unclear whether that's the case. So there is a relationship with guilt proneness and religiosity in terms of extrinsic religiosity. That's a correlation. So people who report that religion is more important to their lives also score higher on guilt proneness. But in terms of different types of religion, it doesn't seem to be a reliable pattern. So these are means from about 800 people, a big online survey. You know, we have mostly Christian people in this survey, but you know, so the other groups are considerably smaller. But if you just look at, say, Protestant Christians versus Catholics versus Jews, there's not a big difference in the level of guilt proneness. You do see somewhat less for people who report being atheist or agnostic, but and then there's different other categories people report in different smaller numbers.
Yeah.
So,
We have time.
time now? Okay. Okay, I got it. So, wait, so you said we are out of time now?
We are.
Okay, I still had 9 minutes on my timer.
If you want to.
All right, I'll wrap it up. So the other dimension, honesty, humility, is relevant to character as well, but I can come back to that. And the only thing I wanted to say was about the stability and observability with some of our preliminary data. So this is, if we look at the self-observer correlation, this tests the idea, can we see character? And I've posited that guilt proneness and honesty, humility are particularly relevant to character. There's self-observer agreement. You know, if I say I am high in guilt proneness, my coworker says this person would probably feel pathetic about the way they acted at the observer report. They're correlated 0.5, which is pretty high, I think. And it's not different statistically from other dimensions of personality, like agreeableness, like emotionality. Slightly less magnitude than extroversion, which is a very observable trait. You know, there's lots of behaviors associated with extroversion we can see. In terms of the reliability over 13 weeks, we have a high degree of stability, I think, but a little bit less than the other dimensions of personality. So this is summarized here, but our preliminary conclusion is these character traits are just as observable as many other dimensions of personality, but perhaps not as observable as, say, extroversion or openness to experience, which there's a lot of observable behaviors associated with those things. Seems to be relatively stable, at least over adults, right, over 3 months. But those correlations were a little bit smaller than the other dimensions, suggesting that it's possible that character is somewhat more variable than other personality dimensions, but that awaits some further testing. So on that note, I will end and just say the workplace is an interesting place to study character and unethical behaviors, and I welcome your questions.
All right.
Yeah, so thanks. Really interesting stuff. So 2 quick questions. So the coworker that is supposed to observe the worker, did you say that person was selected by the worker?
But it's by the worker, yeah. So
Okay.
yeah, so they're probably, I think, based on what they said, I think they're probably friends with the person. So I would say the people in the survey were part of a panel. So we had, they could be emailed. The coworkers were not. So we said, please provide us with a name and a coworker, name and email address who would be willing to take a survey about you. I don't think the observability that we'd see, for example, would be generalizable to all people that they work with, right? This would be a little different.
So two quick questions about that in that case. So first of all, do you think that can affect the data, that you know who is observing you? And also secondly, do you, so I just don't know I'm a philosopher, I don't know any data. So the question would be, knowing a person that you're observing, does that make you more or less reliable in terms of objectively evaluating them for?
That's a great question. So I think it can, well, I'll say what we did put in a lot of instructions about anonymity. So say there's paragraphs in both surveys saying your coworkers' responses will never be shared with you. They won't, the same. So we did our best to ensure to the participants that it wasn't, their coworker wouldn't see their data and they wouldn't see their coworkers' data. So, but certainly, you've just taken a survey for 4 weeks where you've reported on your good and bad behaviors, and now you're inviting a coworker to take a survey about you. So I certainly think that could influence the results. So that's why I wouldn't say that just because we find, say, a self-observer correlation with coworkers in this study means it's generalizable to all workplace settings. I do think it's generalizable to people who know you well at work. And it's unclear to me whether people, because the survey was going on over an extended period of time, how conscious they would be about really changing their behavior at work every day, all day. So, we did the best we could in that we tried to maintain anonymity, but certainly it's a method that's used, I'd say, in the organizational literature. So the idea, self-reports have a lot of advantages. You know more about yourself than other people. I know about my own behaviors. There was a meta-analysis recently of counterproductive work behaviors that actually found self-reports were more valid, accurate than observer reports. Because if I'm stealing office supplies, I'm not telling my coworkers or my boss what I'm doing. I'm trying to be private. So on the other hand, there's certainly if someone invites me to take a survey about them, I might be predisposed to be more favorable about them or about myself. Yeah. Yeah, so I think I'll feel more confident if we're finding similar findings across different types of assessment. I mean, that's the idea with multiple methods and why we wanted both self-reports and observer reports. If it doesn't matter which way we're asking the questions, how we're asking the questions, and to whom, then there's a good, we can have some confidence that it's really these constructs that are driving relationships.
Yes, me?
Two questions about kind of the conditions under which they're filling out surveys. I don't know whether these would affect, because I'm not only not a psychologist, but I'm a philosopher, theologian. First, analyzing based on time steps, whether they fill them out at work or at home, because I imagine people might have different attitudes toward work.
Yeah, they were sent out over the weekend, so I'm guessing they were filled out at home, but I don't know. I mean, we sent them out at Friday afternoons, like around 5 o'clock, and people were in different time zones, and we gave them a deadline by Monday night at midnight. Some people filled them out Tuesdays. So I don't know if timestamps are reliable given that people are in different time zones and people work in different kinds of industries. And that's an interesting question. So are you at work when you're filling this out? We didn't have that question because that's kind of a bad behavior, right? You're doing personal. But certainly, so the advantage of having a large survey like this, 1,500 people, is there's a lot of noise. There's a lot of variability, all these different things that could be affecting some people. As long as it's not systematic, which I'm hoping it's not, and assuming it's not, then I'm not sure the extent to which that would be a concern. But it could, if they were doing it, certainly.
But I guess the other question, might be more systematic is that you're doing it at the end of the week.
Yep.
I guess people do also kind of feel more, perhaps optimistic about happier.
Yeah, they're going into the weekend. So it's, we do have the time and date when they completed it, so I can compare the people who completed on Monday versus Friday. That would be interesting, just their emotions, just life satisfaction on Mondays versus Fridays. So it's possible.
Christian, you have something?
Yeah, that was my question.
Okay.
All right. Will?
Yeah, I want to go back to the question about the observers being friends, because I think that's such an important finding. I mean, those relations are huge.
Yeah.
And much higher than most of the target observers.
Yeah, so I will say there's some work by Ashton and Lee with the Hexaco. Those are similar, and that's with college students. They're similar in the college students who know each other very well. So they've broken down their data with people who know each other very well versus people who are less well acquainted. They've found high correlations like that. People who know each other well. I think if it was people who didn't know each other well, it would be much lower. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's a subtle point about correlations here that is really important to make clear, and that is when you get a strong correlation, what that means is that people are using the whole range of the scale, and they're agreeing on where you are on that range of the scale. So it's not that because they know them well, but the high correlation doesn't mean they're saying favorable things about it.
Right.
What it means is that these people who know them well are saying, yeah, they're real jerks, right? It's not like they're biased in the positive direction. If they were biased in the positive direction because they knew them well, you get a smaller correlation.
Right. Yeah.
So it's really
effect.
important that high correlation means that the observers, that these people who know them well, are saying, yeah,
Yeah.
nasty, selfish people.
Yeah.
So,
That's a really important part. So I would, the only qualification I make, I'm not sure they're saying they're nasty, selfish people, but they're saying they would feel a little bit bad, but not that bad. So in terms of, say, guilt proneness, the range on that scale, some people do use the whole thing. Most people fall in between, say, slightly likely and very likely, but there is a wide variation within that range, at least sort of on the higher end of the scale. So there are very few people in the sample that would say, well, I would feel just fine, like if I did these things, and the coworkers aren't saying that. But some people are saying, well, that person would feel a little bit bad, and they're not all saying 7s, they're not overly biased.
well, you couldn't get the correlation if people aren't going down to the low end of the scale. You couldn't have gotten the correlation.
Right.
So they have to be going down, and the observers have to be going down there with them at the same time. Yeah.
So that's a good point. Thank you.
Yeah.
Linda?
I just have a small question about the guilt proneness
Yeah,
survey.
sure.
You had this very amusing example of spilling red wine
Yeah.
on a colored carpet, and would you feel pathetic? Pathetic
Right.
was the word. And everybody laughed. I laughed.
Yeah.
And I think that, well, I think I laughed because the term pathetic is it's very rich in meaning.
Yeah.
It doesn't just mean feel bad. I think I might say I would feel bad about that, but I wouldn't say I felt pathetic. Pathetic sounds like I'm a pitiful creature.
Yeah, so this is the way you acted was, there is a subtle distinction, and I agree with you. If you said I'm pathetic, I think that would be different. The way you acted was pathetic.
Well, I'm not sure I would even agree.
Okay, so, and maybe that's part of it. So, that's good. Well, that is one of the things. So one of the things that we did in developing this measure was we didn't want, if I just said, would you feel bad about this? I think we'd get a lot more people on the extreme ends of the scale. Yes, I would feel, I'd feel bad. And we did want variability. So in developing this, we had come up with, say, 60 to 100 items that varied in severity of the transgression, that varied in the severity of the response. We did a lot of different psychometric analyses and factor analyses, figuring out which items loaded together that seemed to represent the construct in a, I wouldn't say broad way, but not a very narrow way. So we wanted to kind of get at this idea that certain people are more likely to think that they would feel bad about a behavior. So that's the idea, but we didn't just want to use the same words just to get at sort of one level of severity. So I think the fact that you're saying that, yeah, I might say I would feel bad, very likely, but I wouldn't necessarily say I would feel the way I acted was pathetic. Yeah. So if someone who is very guilt-prone would say, yeah, I would think the way I act is pathetic, and they would be higher on the scale. Any particular item, I agree with you, is, we couldn't take any one item and say, well, this is the measure, but the combination of them seems to represent this construct, and just using 4 as opposed to others that we've developed, we don't seem to be losing predictive.
Well, I mean, I agree you may need another word. It's just that pathetic has there's a lot of meaning built into it that you may not want to be touching on.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. Yeah, in some of the future work, we've kind of debated about whether we want to add more items, change items. I can say reasonably well that we're able to find this is predictive and more reliable than we might have thought, given that there's a lot of differences going on between these items. So the fact that they're hanging together relatively well is interesting.
Charlie? Still have some?
Just quickly, did the survey discriminate between whether somebody thought that they felt guilty at the thought of or the representation of doing something, or whether there was some sort of anticipation where I don't feel guilty now, but I anticipate that I will feel guilty later on?
So for the guilt proneness, which is one measure, just in the initial survey, if you imagine that you were in these situations, these are the items, but every week we have an emotion checklist that says, during the past week, to what extent did you feel guilty, ashamed, happy, sad, angry, embarrassed, humiliated, calm, different things. And so for this particular questionnaire, no, it's what you would see here. We do have other measures of emotion, and along with other questionnaires, about, say, how you were treated at work. So one thing that we hopefully will be able to find out is, people who are reporting abusive supervision, workplace ostracism during the past week, what extent is that affecting their emotions over the remainder of the survey? How is that affecting their intention to turn over, and leaving, and how much sleep they're getting, even. So we don't have, we have some open-ended questions about, say, if you reported you experienced a lot of conflict at work this way, please describe this conflict. We do have a few items like that we've mixed in to try and get a richer picture of what's going on at the organization. But what my hope is taking these different measures, emotions as well as the workplace experiences, kind of to get a little more, flesh that out a bit. What is, I don't want to say causing, but what is related to these emotions?
We have time for one last short question.
First of all, what a great data set. Data jealousy. I think you said from a workshop approach we could brainstorm about potential analyses to do. I think one really interesting thing to do would be to look at character by organizational culture interactions and predicting unethical behavior. And I think one prediction is that if the organizational culture is perceived as highly legitimate, they treat us well, they respect us, it's fair, you might get low levels of unethical behavior overall, and maybe character won't contribute so much to it. But then what's interesting is when the organizational culture is perceived as bad, supervisors are unkind, processes are not fair, then you could look at what character traits are going to predict unethical behavior or refraining from unethical behavior, even when the overall culture would seem to encourage it or permit it or elicit it in some people.
Yeah, that's great. There's some preliminary work at the Hexaco that they looked at perceptions of organizational politics, which is one of the measures we had here, that found a similar interaction. And some of our preliminary data, we started to look at, like, to the extent that there's high levels of interpersonal conflict at work, that people are treating you in nasty ways, would it be the high guilt-prone people that would just ignore those things, or would it be the low guilt-prone people that would be kind of commit these behaviors regardless of the culture at work, but the high guilt people would be more sensitive to the culture. So you can predict different patterns for those interactions as well.
And they depend on different moral values.
Yeah.
Because I think that some people consider reciprocity a moral value.
Yeah.
Right? People who believe in reciprocity, well, if you're mistreating me, I'm going to destroy the copy machine.
Yeah.
They might consider that.
Yeah, good quote.
Thing to do. That's fair.
Yeah, I'll make good deals on I for a copy machine.
Maybe I try to do the right thing no matter what.
Right.
And you might find different dimensions of moral belief.
Yeah, and I think that might be an interesting, one question I've had is whether different character traits respond differently. So I think guilt proneness actually is about the social norms. So I feel guilty when I violate social norms or moral norms. I think that should correspond to people's, if there's a bad work environment, they'll be unethical just like everybody else, but if there's a good work environment, they won't. But I think maybe honesty, humility might behave quite differently, just based on some of the preliminary papers that I've seen on this, where people who are high in honesty, humility, regardless of the situation, they're just going to be the good people at work.
There's also a scale called social responsibility that we find tends to predict that. And the scale items are basically like, even if everyone else is cheating, I'm not going to. Or even if other people are littering, I'm not going to. So it's no matter what's going on, I do the right thing.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important question for the study of character is, differentiating these kinds of character traits. When is some more relevant than others? When are, you get those people, that's one of the differences between honesty and humility and agreeableness, where honesty, humility, they've described as not doing, cooperating with someone even when there's no risk of being caught, even when you could potentially take advantage of them, whereas agreeableness is cooperating with someone even when they've taken advantage of you and you're forgiving of them. So I think there's these subtle differences. Cooperation could be character in both settings, but there's different traits that might be relevant to certain kinds of cooperation than others.
All right, we'll have to end there. We'll try to start our next session right on time, which means we've got a short break. Try to be back by 10 for the next session. Thank you.